Experience the real tube tone your music deserves with the Amp Mojo Soul Drive. Powered by a Tongue Soul 12A-X7 vacuum tube, the Soul Drive delivers that dynamic response and warmth only a genuine tube can provide. Built in the USA with tour-grade durability, the Amp Mojo Soul Drive at ampmojo.com.
Hello and welcome to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. I'm your host, Ram Tuli. This podcast is about the joy of guitar. That includes buying guitars, selling guitars, collecting guitars. We're talking vintage guitars, new guitars, used guitars, pre-war, flat tops, electric Spanish arch tops, custom shop guitars, limited edition guitars, basses, amps, effect pedals, lap steels, mandolins, banjo. If it has strings, we're going to talk about it. I spent most of my life studying the vintage guitar market. It's truly something I love and I'm passionate about. I can talk guitars all day, and I'm going to. Today, I'm speaking with my good friend, John Majdalani, co-owner and proprietor of Cream City Music in Brookfield, Wisconsin. How you doing, John?
Good, Ram. How are you doing?
Good. Thank you so much for doing this podcast. I remember way back when I first started doing the price guide, you were one of the first guys I called, and it was because I was told, like, this was the guy to talk to. John was the guy. So I called you, and I remember we talked about why vintage guitars are priced the way they are. And you introduced to me the concept that there's really three things that make up the price on a vintage guitar. And one is the rarity. The second one was historical significance. And the third is the most important. That's the wow factor. You know, last week I talked about the six-figure guitars, the ones that the most valuable. Well, 90% of people out there collecting vintage guitars are not ever going to put one of these into their collection. But there are so many opportunities out there for a guitar, like $2,500 guitar, that will actually accrue quite a bit of value and have a lot of wow factor in it.
I agree. Yeah, absolutely. There are dozens out there really to choose from that, you might even want to call them sleeper guitars, or they're guitars that over the years have just slowly been creeping up in price. And so those are the ones I think that for a lot of folks who don't want to bust the bank or spend a lot of money can find a really well-made guitar at a really affordable price.
So when did you guys start Cream City?
Cream City as a business actually started back in 1999, and I and my two business partners were all employees of the original owner who sold it to us 11 years ago in 2013. So the business has been around for a long time, but us as owners, we've been at it now for just over a decade.
Has Cream City always had vintage guitars, or was it mostly new guitars or used guitars, new used and vintage?
It was kind of a combination. When I went to go work for the owner, it was over 20 years ago now. There aren't a lot of vintage shops in Milwaukee. There was one that was sort of my local shop when I first moved to town many years ago that I would go to. And he had a small selection of really cool vintage guitars. Nothing, that would blow your mind, but really good, affordable stuff. And then when I went to go work for Cream City Music, the owner did have some, used in vintage pieces. But my role when I went to go work with him was I really wanted to do what we could to really put Cream City Music on the map as sort of like the premier vintage guitar shop in this part of the country. So he and I worked really closely together over the 10 years. Doing guitar shows, acquiring collections, and really acquiring some of the things that you would see, as you mentioned earlier in your podcast, on the coasts, guitars that you would typically find in LA or New York. And so we really started getting more and more of those into the shop. And that's kind of how we grew that part of the business.
And would you say right now, Cream City, is it about half and half, new and vintage used?
It's probably more new in terms of just quantity in the store. There is a large selection of used and vintage guitars, but in terms of overall guitar count, there are probably more new guitars in the shop than there are used and vintage.
And you handle the vintage side in the partnership, right?
Right. So my role didn't really change when we took over as owners 10 years ago. My passion has always been guitars, and more specifically, the older stuff, the vintage guitars. Right. And I really didn't want that to change. I'd been doing guitar shows, attending guitar shows, acquiring guitars through these shows, hitting the road, buying collections from private parties, going into people's homes, having conversations, getting phone calls because we advertise through your magazine, through Vintage Guitar Magazine, and people would call up, and that again prompted me to kind of hit the road and buy these collections. So I didn't want that to change just because I became an owner. I wanted to keep doing that.
And the one thing it's really important is to point out is that the world of vintage guitars, it is concentrated on East Coast and West Coast. But right there in the Midwest, there's a huge opportunity to find some of the best vintage guitars for a price point that's a little bit under what you would pay on the coast, right?
Yeah. Traditionally, well, think about it. Your three major cities in the States, right, in New York, LA, and Chicago. And Chicago's only a 90-minute drive south of Milwaukee. But then in the Midwest, you've got such a huge collection of states where they're kind of sleeper states. I mean, look where we are. You've got Wisconsin, Minnesota, Michigan, Ohio, Indiana, Iowa, even down to, places like Kansas. There's a big sort of section of the Midwest where a lot of rock and roll towns are there, besides Milwaukee, Chicago, Minneapolis, Detroit, Kansas City, etc. So you can find really cool guitars.
And you got to think like Kalamazoo and Chicago. Think of all the vintage stuff that came out of Kalamazoo and Chicago.
Think about it.
That went right in there. It is true that, if you're a Fender guy, you'll probably find a lot more Fenders in Los Angeles area. But yeah, we always tell people the Midwest, you always got to look there. There's always something special just waiting for you.
Well, traditionally, I think you find a lot of cool guitars in towns that had big music scenes, lots of music clubs and things like that. Like when I do guitar shows, if you go down to places in Florida, like in, the Miami area, Orlando, historically way back when they had a lot of great clubs down there. And, a lot of great bands came out of Florida in the 60s and 70s. So you'll see those types of guitars floating around down there.
Right. So let's say somebody came to you and said, I got $2,500 and I want to buy something special. I can't afford, a pre-CBS Stratocaster, but I want something that's going to blow my mind. What would you tell them to go first? What would you bring out for them first?
Well, you start off with what's he kind of looking for? A lot of people say, well, there's two guitars out there. There's Fender and there's Gibson, right? And so everyone's either gravitating towards a Les Paul or an SG, something solid body with a couple of humbuckers. Or the other side of the spectrum, something with a couple of single coils like a Tele or a Strat. So the first thing you always have a conversation with somebody about is, do you have an idea of what you'd like? Something solid body, or is it semi-hollow like an ES335 style? Or do you like something full hollow? Are you more of a jazz player? And then you just start kind of narrowing it down from there. In terms of affordability, if you're speaking strictly vintage,
yeah.
I always talk to people about Guild.
Oh,
Guild,
absolutely.
Over the years, there were a lot of models that were made in the 60s that were based similarly to, let's say, Gibson guitars. Like, look at your Starfire line. If somebody wanted, let's say, a 60s Gibson ES335, those are getting into a price point now that's out of a lot of people's budgets. Mm-hmm. But take a look at a Starfire. It's a semi-hollow, double humbucker guitar, very much built on the same platform as a 335.
And when you think of the psychedelic music scene of San Francisco, that was a Starfire 3 on all those Strawberry Alarm Clock, all that stuff. All those bands were using Starfires.
Well,
crazy.
Sure. And those guitars are very affordable. Even in the acoustic line too. If you don't want to, if you don't have the money to get, let's say, a Martin D28, a Brazilian D28, or a D35, look at the Gibson, or look at the Guild, D50 or D40 or something like that. It's a well-made flat top acoustic guitar at a really great price.
Right.
Same with the solid bodies. The Guild, the Polara, the Thunderbird. Things like that are I think, sleeper guitar. Maybe not so much the Thunderbird. Those seem to be really kind of jumping up in price. But Polara is a great guitar. I own one myself.
Mm-hmm. Now, one of the things, like when I ranked, I went through and I keep track of everything, as you know. And I went through and I found guitars in my 3000 guitar index that had the best return. I mean, they basically at least doubled in value every 6 to 7 to 8 years. And I found that the sleeper guitars, these are the Japanese lawsuit stuff. Do you guys get a lot of that?
Periodically. I wouldn't say we get a ton of them. I would say most of the ones that we get are the Artist series, the sort of double cut solid bodies, some plain, some with flame tops. The ones that really jumped were those straight Gibson knockoffs, like the Destroyer, which was based on the Explorer. There was the Futura that was based on the Modern. And then, of course, the the Rocket Roll Senior. I think that's what it was called, the Rocket Roll, that looks just like a flying V.
Right.
Remember when I was first sort of getting into this, those were still only a few $100s. Now they're a few thousand.
Right.
I see guys asking $4, $5, $6 for those guitars.
And they were all made at the same factory, is what I was told. Tokai or whoever had Sol Ibanez, whatever. They are all made at the same factory. So that the secret was to know which ones really mattered by the pickups and combinations and things like that. And so, but yeah, the Tokai, Les Paul Reborn, the Slinky, the Springy Sound.
Yeah, those are great guitars.
Those are now $1,500. 3 years ago, 5 years ago, they were half that, and they're moving. And the Destroyer, like the knockoff of the Explorer, you go to a guitar show, you see those people are getting a big bucks for those.
They're asking a lot for those. Yeah, like I said, I see people asking $4, $5, sometimes $6,000 for those guitars.
Crazy. It's just now as far as the Gibson line, what about the ES 120s Ts? Are those? I know those are affordable, but are they available?
I've had them. I've had quite a few over the years. Funny guitar because, it just has that one single coil pickup that's kind of mounted in that oversized pick guard there. And, they're fun. I don't see a lot of players necessarily gravitating towards those. Maybe if you're an ES collector and you've got one of every model, you might want to just get the 120 to complete the collection. But you know what? I'll tell you what I have seen that's really kind of jumped in the Gibson line. It's not really a vintage. Well, I suppose it's becoming vintage. They came out in the early 90s. If you remember the Double Cut series, which was sort of Gibson's, I guess, take on maybe making something that looked a bit like a Les Paul, still had the carved top with the flame, but it was a double cut contour, kind of looked like the old Juniors and Specials from the late 60s, from the late 50s and early 60s. Couple of humbuckers, but just a master volume and tone. So there was the DC Pro, and then they came out with the DC Standard, and then there was a Plus and a Studio and different iterations of the guitar. And, when I remember playing those and picking those up many, many years ago, you can get them for $800, $900. These days, they're like $200 to $2,500.
Right. In fact, I get emails, I'll get emails every day, like, how come this isn't in the guide? How come this isn't in the guide? I got an email from somebody saying, why don't you have the DCs? And I'm like, you're right. So this year we put them in there, the gold top ones. I
think it all started with the gold top. I think it was called the DC Pro that came out maybe around 92 or 93. So that's already a 30-year-old guitar.
Right.
You might want to classify that as vintage. And then in the late 90s, the other models followed. But, somebody has once told me that, it was sort of Gibson's response to maybe the, trying to make something that was PRS-ish. But I don't know if I bite down on that, that body design had already more or less existed in Gibson culture. And I think it's just a more Spartan kind of Les Paul, lighter, still had the slim taper neck, a couple of beefy humbuckers, but half the knobs and, but all the spanks.
Gorgeous guitars. They did a really nice job with those.
Look at the flame tops on those guitars. Yep. They're gorgeous. And we've had just about every color over the years. I mean, red, blue, green, root beer, you name it, amber. They didn't cheap out on the tops on those guitars. And if, based on, our theme here, sleepers, I think that really qualifies is those DCs. I can't keep them in the shop, to be honest with you. I bought a collection of them about a year ago. There were about 8 or 9. And each time I would put one up, I started posting them up online. And within a day or so, they just, gone at the prices we were asking. So definitely a sleeper guitar that's on the rise.
Now, as far as like in the old days, like, the thing that became an accessible way to delve into the world of instruments was to go after the student models. These were the guitars that were designed as entry level for beginners, but they have gained a lot of popularity because they have historical significance. And, they have the same pickups and the same wood that you would find, and probably when we think of Gibson, we think of the Melody Makers. You can still get Melody Makers for about $2,500. Good ones. Do you see a lot of those come through?
Yeah, I would say during COVID, during the COVID years, let's call it that, sort of 20 to 22, even up until last year, the prices on those shock through the roof. You're right. I started seeing single pickup, melody makers going for around two pickups, around 25, even up to three. You'd go to guitar shows and, guys were asking, the stars, the moon and the sun for these guitars. And I remember as a kid, I'd go into a guitar shop in the 80s and you couldn't give them away. They were
right. They were just kind of like the knockoff single layer, cut. But the thing is, like, Gibson, and then you had the Epiphone level and the Olympics now, you could get these. I mean, those may be sleepers, right? The Olympics from that same era that were very, very cheap.
Same thing with the Olympics, the coronets that were based on the juniors too. Again, when I was younger, it was nobody wanted a junior. It was a student guitar, and then they started, moving up in price. But what happens is it's all connected, right? So when what's the top of the line, right? It's the standard, and then from there you get your customs, your gold tops, and things like that. So when all those guitars just start jumping up in price, it kind of just brings the whole line up with it, if you know what I mean.
Right.
So 57 whatevers, are going up in price, and then that'll bring up the juniors, and that brings up the specials, and then of course it trickles all the way down to the melody makers, and those come up.
And they tie into the Epiphone versions, which are now, in fact, the Epiphone, I tell people like all the time, look at those coronets, look at the Wilshires, look at the, all that stuff, that the single cut stuff, the symmetric, the ones that were made with the New York pickups, those are going for big bucks now, and they were only a couple of $100 10 years ago. Crazy.
Right.
Another student model, which you see a lot. Remember the old Silvertone 1448 amp in a case?
Sure.
That's like everybody's first vintage guitar. Well, it used to be for a lot of people. The only thing is, I don't think those will ever really go up in value more than where they are. I don't ever see those like growing the way a melody maker or a duosonic would. But they're a novelty item, and they're great sound and tone machines.
That's a good point. Yeah, and they made two versions. Of course, you could get the single pickup amp in case. You can get the double pickup amp in case, and of course, that one's more expensive than the single. But sure, it's still an under $1,000 guitar.
Right, and it might. I every once in a while I'll see one that goes for $1,200. But those are exceptional value. They're just in great shape.
Right.
But they're novelty. I mean, most people should have one. I think if you have a great large collection, there's nothing that quite sounds like that. Those old Dan Electros or those old Silvertones, they just have a tone.
Well, they're fun, right? And the same thing with the amplifier too. I mean, if you look at some of the old just Silvertone amps, some of those command some pretty eyebrow raising prices that years ago you would think, well, this is $100 amp or $200 amp. Now I'm seeing them in $500, $600, $800.
Right, especially when the Fender Tweeds become so expensive. People are looking for something that sounds really darn close. And a lot of those Dan Electros amps sound very, very close.
And they had great tremolo. They had good reverb. They had great tremolo.
Even before Fender did.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, lovely amps.
Another student model that some people kind of hype about were the Vox Student Princes. But you don't see those much anymore. But those are $500-$600 guitars now if you can get one. But I don't know if there's like a huge demand. I don't know if anybody's out there scouting, but whenever they talk about these student models, they always throw in that Vox Student Prince.
Well, I'm kind of a freak for those. I mean, I've always loved, anything sort of Anglophile. And, most of the Vox guitars that we've had over the years have been the Italian-made Voxes, which they're, again, going up. Guitars like those Phantoms and
that EKO Rocket. The EKO Rocket is, I think that was on my list last year for moving quickly up.
Sure. Well, any of those that were, Italian made, 6-string, 12-string, years ago, not that long ago, maybe an $1,100-$1,200 guitar, that price is now doubled.
Right. And of course, the most famous student models of all time are the Fenders now. If you told me
Duosonics.
If you told me 20 years ago, people were going to be paying close to $5,000 for some of these, I would have bought a lot of them.
Sure, right.
Because you could always find them for very good shape.
Shoulda, coulda, woulda.
That kind of like, I think the Duosonic kind of is out of our price range if you're looking for something under 2.5. But the Music Master's kind of in that range. It's very similar to the Duosonic.
Yeah.
You see those.
Similar.
You don't see as many as you see the Duosonics, but.
I see mostly the bass version, the Music Master bass.
Right.
For some
and
reason,
those are big sellers right now. Those are huge.
They sure are. Those have really crept up pretty quickly. And for some reason, it's the bass that I tend to see at guitar shows. And I don't see as many guitars, but mostly the bass. But, in all the great colors, black, Olympic white, red, things like that. Good bass to get. I mean, it's a guitar pickup, so you may want to think about swapping that out for something a little beefier, but still a really nice, affordable bass.
I'm always surprised at how many Music Master basses I see every month that it's sold. It's crazy. And then, of course, the Mustang. It's getting harder to find one under $2,500 now.
Yeah.
There really are creeping up there where I see people paying a little over $3,000 now for good ones.
And if you want a competition, it's another $1,000.
Right. The orange, I see many orange competitions now, $5,000, which didn't really matter. The Kurt Cobain thing didn't matter for a little bit, but now it matters again. I've seen a lot of orange go for well over $5,000, which is crazy.
Right, and condition is key, of course.
Key, yep. And the Mustang, I think for our generation, most people I know, that was their very first foot in the door for a vintage guitar, getting a 65, 66 Mustang. And then that was like, hey, look, I'm playing a vintage Fender. It was a huge matter of pride to own one. But you can still get them $300,000, $4,000. They're creeping up there now. They're moving like most other things.
And I think manufacturers like Fender and Gibson, they're making brand new product, but they've got a lot of smart folks there, and they're aware of the vintage market, and they're aware of some of these items that we're talking about now. These creepers that are really starting to not necessarily skyrocket, but they're really going up in price. And I think they're responding to that by introducing some of these again. I mean, Fender makes the Mustang bass again, and they're doing Duosonics and things like that because they know the vintage ones, are out of certain people's budgets.
Looking for juicy tube tone? Introducing the Soul Drive, the ultimate responsive tube overdrive pedal. Whether you're chasing vintage warmth or high-gain crunch, the Soul Drive gives you total control. Unleash your creativity. Available now at ampmojo.com and juice that tone.
So I made this list, the best return right now for under $2,500. Number one on the top of that list is the Charvel Model 4. So these were the first that they made overseas in 87, 88 era.
Okay.
And those are $1,000 now, but they're moving. They're doubled in price in the last 5 years.
Yeah.
Which is cool. So I always tell people, look for the Charvels. Look for the old Charvels. Look for American-made Charvels. BC Rich Warlocks now. They're $2,500. Those also have doubled in price in the last 5 years. Hamers, anything Hamer, the low-end Hamer is now starting to move. The high-end Hamer has been moving for a long time, but, keep your eyeballs peeled for these Hamers. 86.
Like the sun, right. Okay. So like the Sunburst model.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Yeah. Yep. $2,000, $2.5, $3,000, Sharper L's, all those. Here's one that's really caught my eye is the Harmony Buck Owens. Remember that red, white, and blue guitar?
Yeah.
That thing has a return. That thing doubles in value almost 8.5 years. That's a sleeper. I mean, you could get one for $2,000, $2,500. And who wouldn't want to?
See very many of those lately. I think they all got bought up because they were coming out of the woodwork. I was probably getting a Buck Owens about once a month, and that was a guitar that went from $500 to $2,000 almost overnight.
Yep, and you're right. We don't really see them, because the people are putting them on the walls. They're buying them and putting them on the wall.
Well, same thing with the Buck Owens Tully. I think that was an MIJ guitar, wasn't it? It had the sort of the sparkle red, white, and blue, body finish, and those have really shot up. It just seems like anything that was Buck Owens related just kind of went through the roof.
Gorgeous. I think they're cool looking guitars. Dan Electro convertibles. The 60s, mid 60s Dan Electros. Those have doubled in price in the last 5 years. Most are under $1,000. But if you can buy one with how they had 3 different colors, if you can get one of the colored ones, that can be that's a mover, right? That's a
guitar.
Another one, Burns. Last year, Burns. The Marvin and the Bisons. Those started moving. Those are now over $2,000, which is crazy, but
we had a cool one. We had the bass. It was the orange bass, the one that I think George Harrison supposedly played the bass line to on a Beatles song. Maybe it was Taxman or something. Ram, you might remember the model of that one. It evades me right now, but that was a hot bass.
The Vibraslim?
Is that what it was called? I don't
remember exactly. They're Baby Bisons. They all had the comparable model, bass and guitar with the same.
Sure.
They just restrung them. Another one is the Rick Model 420 from the 60s. That's another one that's doubled in price.
Yeah, I was just looking at, it's funny you bring that up because I was just doing some research for a customer. I was looking for a 450. I was looking for an early combo and, just kind of shocked to see what some of the early, I remember selling those 425s and 450s. They were, anywhere between 1,000 to 1,500. And, now you can't get one under $2. So
yeah, if you can find them, I tell people, if you find them, grab them for sure.
The Hagstrom 8-string bass. There's another one for you. The H8.
Yes.
That again, the connection to Hendrix with the Hagstrom 8-string, great bass. Something that when we were kids, it was cheap. It was a couple.
The Hagstrom
$100.
Vikings also are kind of moving. The Honers, the Hagstroms, all these ones that were kind of sleeping for a long time have come alive in the last couple of years, and that's just because.
There are a few. There's some that are still out there that I think, I don't know if they're, like you mentioned with the Silvertones, I don't know if they're ever going to go
right.
anywhere.
The Silvertones and the Dan Electros, you'll be lucky to get your money back 5-10 years. But
sure,
other things, there's definitely things that matter. And that's what we're trying to do here is like the late 60s Duosonics. Those are, $2,500. They double in price. They've doubled in price the last 5 years.
Mm-hmm.
Kramer stuff. Kramer, there's been something weird going on with Kramer. Kramer didn't catch fire the way a lot of the pointy guitars like the Charvels, Hamers, and I'm never really quite sure why that is, but I know people that when they see Kramers that are at good prices will buy them because they know sooner or later they'll take off again.
Well, keep in mind that when those guitars were first coming out and guys were playing them back in the early 80s, Van Halen and guys like that, that's when guys who are my age now, we were a lot younger, we were sort of preteen and teen, and so they were inexpensive guitars back then and they remained relatively inexpensive. But as we got older, right, you earn more, right, you get a better job, you advance in life, and so you can start affording those types of things. And so, the guys kind of look back, they're like, well, I remember those guitars when I was a kid. And, sometimes you could afford it, sometimes you couldn't. And it depends on which Kramer, it's you might know this better than me. I think it's the Pacer that seems to have kind of shot through the roof. It's
shot up, but it's, you're basically talking about, you're still in that 1,000 going to 1,200, that kind of a thing. People always ask about the old metal neck ones, aluminum neck ones, like the DMZ 3000. Those kind of they kind of sit at the same price forever. But I know people that buy them when they see them. So.
Oh, they're heavy as all heck. So
yep.
I don't know who's. You got to be a hefty guy to.
Yeah, and you gotta have a good luthier who knows how to deal with the neck issues with the metal and wood splitting apart. What about Music Man? Do you think Music Man will ever really, like the Steve Morse models or some of the Sabres, do you think those will ever catch on?
I bought a Sabre actually at the Nashville Guitar Show earlier this year, and I think I paid a really good price for it. I have it up on my website right now. Going up, but maybe not quite as exponentially as, some of the other things that we've talked about. Still a bit of a price increase, but not one of these things where it's like, oh shit, I better buy this now, or I'll miss the boat. I think you can still buy those. It's kind of like G&L, for all intents and purposes. G&L it's a Fender guitar, right?
Right. It's incredible craftsmanship. Great guitars, but they'll never pop over.
Yeah, they're not going crazy.
They're not going to pop up.
you can buy most G&Ls for under $1,000, and it's just so. Music Man's probably, I think, going to suffer the same fate.
Now we talked about the guilds, like the Troubadour F20. That one is starting to move. Epiphone flat tops and guilds from the 50s are starting to move, and that's because they're following the other. Right now, flat tops are hot, red hot, like Gibson flat tops, Martin flat tops. So now people are starting to find that they can buy these 50s flat tops, which are great guitars, and they can get them for a pretty good price.
Well, as I said at the beginning of the podcast, don't overlook Guild. Guild has been a sleeper guitar for many, many years, much longer than what we've been talking about here in the last few years, or even the last decade. I mean, since probably its inception, it's always been sort of in the shadow of Gibson and Martin. But there are a lot of players who have gravitated towards Guilds that will stand by it, both in the acoustic flat top world and in the electric guitar world as well. Like I said before, the Starfire, the Polara, the Thunderbird, and then of course all of the great, the bluegrass models, the D55, the 40.
And that's an expensive one, the Bluegrass Special, whatever that one's actually really moving. All the flat tops I found, even the Grammar, the ones that kind of just always sat, they're moving now, and that's because flat tops, people are buying them. They're trying to find really good flat tops, and these were really good flat tops that were made.
Yeah, some of those are kind of regional though too. If you're talking about the Grammars and what's the other one?
Mossmans are.
Yeah, Southern guys really knew more about those so much than I never even knew about them when I was younger. You never saw one. You never saw a Grammar with that kind of pointy, goofy headstock. Cool guitar, but you just never saw them. And even now, when I come across them, it's few and far between.
Do you think Ovation will ever be considered a classic guitar that somebody would really invest in?
Well, the problem with Ovation was they came out of the gate with an incredibly futuristic, innovative design with the Lyra Chord bowl back. They were one of the first guitars that had onboard electronics so that you could be stage ready. Look at all of the A-class musicians who were playing Ovations back in the day.
Right.
Glenn Campbell, who else? Cat Stevens had one. John Lennon had one. I think there's even a John Lennon model, if I'm not mistaken. But they still hover around that $500-$600 range. Now there are some Adamus models, that
right.
are way up there in your $2,000-$3,000 range.
Right, but they were at that price 10 years ago also,
But that was it. They hit that peak. They had a great innovative design with the Lyra Chord bowl back, the onboard electronics. I can hit the stage, plug in, I'm ready to go. At the time, it was state of the art, and then that was it. They didn't continue to develop their preamp system. It just kind of stayed the way it was for the next 20, 30, 40 years. And they got left behind by all the other guitar manufacturers that developed these really great onboard electronics, these Fishman pickups and LR bags and you name it. They didn't keep up. And so they got left by the wayside. So guys who like Ovations are, older guys like me who remember them when we were kids.
Right. Everybody had one. And I remember everybody had one because it was it was the perfect acoustic guitar to bring to a gig.
Because there weren't a lot of other things to choose from in the 70s and in the early 80s. It was sort of like the go-to stage guitar. It had that big old knob on the side, but then companies like Taylor came along and just started burying everybody else with their onboard electronics.
Do you believe Taylor? Do you think that they'll ever become a huge vintage guitar market for old Taylors?
There are certain guys who do want some of those older Lemon Grove made, Taylors from whenever that came out. Was that in the early 80s or late 80s, early 90s? The pre-El Cajon models. For the collector's point of view, right? I don't know if they're necessarily a better made guitar than, what they're doing now, but it's for the historical significance. Yeah. I think people really like those.
I will say one thing. I have a lot of acoustic guitars. Probably the best sounding acoustic guitar that I have, and this is counting all my vintage stuff, is a Taylor 415. I play that thing all the time. I remember I bought it. I wanted to go in and buy a D28, but I played them back to back. And when I bought this, it was like the best sounding, tone wise. I was blown away by this. And I still, to this day, when I really want to, if I'm going to record with an acoustic guitar, I usually grab that Taylor 415.
That's the one you like,
That's the one, or 412. I don't know if it's a 412 or a 415. I can't remember off the top of my head. I love Taylor, but it's one of those things where it's just, I don't see it being a classic the way people like look for Martins and that kind, the other flat tops over historically. Now let's talk about the budget guitars of our youth, like the Ks and the Harmonies. Do you think that, like what you pay for one now is what it's going to be worth 10 years, 15 years from now?
No, I mean, the only ones that I think really kind of fall into that category, we touched upon it earlier, would be like the Buck Owens model, the ones that are kind of specific. The Sovereign jumped in price. I remember the Harmony Sovereign, was a $100 guitar for many years. And, that really jumped up. I mean, the last one we sold was around $1,000.
Right.
So put a zero on the end of that number.
1K that I've always wanted was the 161. The Jimmy Reed twin.
Oh, the thin twin. Sure.
Yep, that one is. I see people paying. I see people paying a lot of money for good ones. And that's a very unique historical guitar.
Yeah, big beefy neck. I mean, that's bigger than any sort of Gibson U-shape or Fender's, U-shape, no caster necks, whatever they're putting on those custom shop guitars. But that's a big neck on those Jimmy Reeds. And if anybody's playing them, it's again maybe because of the historical significance, but most of the guys that I talk to, they don't like necks that big. Cool guitar. We sell them when they come.
I just always remember the picture of Jimmy Reed sitting on the cover holding it, and it was just like, it's a cool looking guitar. And if you find one that's cosmetically still in nice shape, because those things really were pawn shop guitars. They sat in windows and turned brown. But if you can find a nice one, those are beautiful looking guitars with the shell, tortoiseshell guard and all that. Those are pretty guitars.
Oh yeah, and they sound great too. Those lipstick pickups sound fantastic.
So as far as you guys sell, you are a custom shop dealer for Fender and Gibson, right?
Yes, both. Mm-hmm.
So if somebody wants to buy a custom shop, do they just come and take it off the wall, or can they actually order something special?
Both, because we have a retail shop here, we do have a wide variety of custom shop guitars that we've ordered from Fender and from Gibson that we stock in the showroom. If there happens to be something that, a customer wants something very specific, because we've got our locals here that have connected with our sales team, and, they'll come in every now and then and say, you know what, can you special make something for me? And it's basically a menu. You pick your body, wood, your type of neck, pickups, things like that. And Fender will do that for you. Gibson, I think you need to be on a more sort of specific platform. They might not make you anything. It has to be based on something that's sort of already current production, and maybe they'll make a slight change for you.
Mm-hmm. And how long would if you ordered a custom shop Strat, you wanted one specifically that's like, maple cap, surf green, how long would it take you to get that guitar?
I would say at least 6 months to a year.
So you can just direct them, say, here's one. Here's one on the wall that has everything. It just has, wow, you can get it today.
Yeah.
And I think
because,
it's easy to...
Gretsch does the same thing. Gretsch falls under FMIC too, and they have their own custom shop. That's, Steve Stearns that does all the, the Gretsch custom shop guitars, and he just makes a fabulous product there. But, if you wanted to do that even, I think you're looking at a pretty lengthy lag time before you're going to see that guitar.
From an investment standpoint, do you think that if you bought a custom shop guitar, do you think it'll accrue value?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Especially if it's kind of like a one-off.
Right.
For instance, we had, it came in the shop not too long ago. It was like a 6121 solid body, with the knotty pine top.
Right.
So that was kind of a one-off that Steve Stearns did that came into the shop not too long ago. And if you remember, those guitars from the 50s, from 55, 56, those early pine top, single, double knots and quadruple knots, depending on how they butterflied the top there. Those guitars are crazy money. We had a custom shop model come in, And I don't even think I advertised it. I think maybe we just did a video of it. And my business partner put that online for social media, and we immediately got a lot of attention on that particular guitar, because the way that guitar was built, unlike the ones that you get at the Terada factory in Japan, or, you know, to a lesser degree, of course, the Electromatic series, that guitar is, I mean, it's a USA made guitar. And quite frankly, because it's modern, plays and feels probably better than, you know, the original ones that you could get in the 50s. You know, Gretchen, they're,
Mm-hmm.
you know, you take 10 Gibsons and you line them up from, 1958, right? They're all pretty much going to play the same. You take 10 Gretches from 58 and line them up. I don't know, maybe 1 out of 10 or 2 out of 10 is going to be a smoker. The other, they can be a little cantankerous.
And, they have issues with the bind, at least the binding is going to be done right. And the neck angle is going to be right.
A little bit later. You see that normally in the 60s with that binding rod. I don't see too many 50s models with the binding issues, but, neck angles, and they were quirky. They're quirky guitars. I mean, for guys who just, they like that kind of stuff. For me, it's too many knobs and too many switches, but they sure are cool.
Now, the custom shop, there is definitely now when we start thinking about it, there are vintage guitars reissues that are vintage guitars now. Like when we think about some of the original custom shop stuff that from the John Page era, those are now 40-year-old guitars, and they command quite a bit of money, don't they? Some of the original custom shop guitars,
specifically, whose name is attached to that. You mentioned John Page. So if you have like a John Page or, Cornetto era guitar, those are kind of the ones that a lot of guys who are into custom shop, who are into collecting custom shop, love that early stuff, because those guys aren't around anymore, right?
Right. In fact, a lot of people like the Cornetto, because he did a lot of rare color. It's just like the old Stratocasters. Rare colors mattered, and I see the rare colored Cornetto era stuff going for $7,000 to $8,000.
Because guys want that stuff, and they'll ask you, let's say if you've got a guitar for sale, it's on your site. If you don't have it, let's say, taken apart or have provenance of who the builder was, they're going to ask you, whose initials are on the neck. They want to be sure that they're getting, a John Page or a Cornetto Strat or Telly from that era, because it's important to them, because those are becoming more and more collectible. Certain guys just gravitate towards certain builders because they just love their work.
About 5 years ago, everybody wanted stuff relicked insanely, like where you basically look like you had a guitar that had no finish on it sometimes. Is that changing now? Are people going back to the NOS, going back more to they want it looking nicer?
The trend is shifting. So those relics and heavy relics don't seem to be quite as popular. Most guys or customers, when they come into the shop, are looking for, they like the closet classic, maybe just sort of gently aged, not dinged up, but not that super bright high gloss finish. It just kind of, Gibson did it really well with their VOS. They do that VOS treatment where, it's a little dull, maybe the hardware, it's not rusty, but it's not also, bright, shiny and sparkling.
I was amazed at, like maybe even 5 years ago, the relics, you would see people with these relics and you're just like, that's just insane. Your guitar has to earn that. You can't just go and buy it up.
Well, so like I was saying, most guys kind of like the NOS or closet classic. Right. Now, as it relates to Fender, now, Gibson, and as of recently, the last couple of years, that they've got their Murphy lab going on down there, and they're doing great things with these light aged and ultra light aged, and they've also done relics and heavy relics. But even with the Gibson world too, I'm seeing more guys sort of, they prefer the light aged or ultra light. So weather checking, maybe a little flaking or nick or ding here, but no real heavy gouging or anything like that.
Like we were talking about $2,500. You could get really good Stratocasters out there, under $2,000. People don't realize that the last of the 81s, 1980 81s, before they actually ran out of inventory, those are $3,000 to $4,000. But that Smith Strat that comes out in 83, that's actually affordable, right?
Yeah, and you got to be careful with that, because a lot of folks have come into the shop and they say, well, I've got a Smith Strat for sale. And what they actually have is that 2-knob Strat, with the jack right on top.
Right.
That Smith era but it's not a Smith Strat per se, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
So,
the two knobs, but you could get those for under $2,000 now still, right?
the two knob, that's maybe $1,100, $1,200
Yeah.
guitar top.
So people that, you don't have to get, like we were saying that the vintage reissues, it's kind of strange that vintage reissues are now vintage guitars. And a lot of times, people always ask me, hey, what should I get? What should I get? And I say, you know what? Look for those early American vintage reissues from the early 80s, 82, 83. Those now command custom shop prices.
Well, specifically the ones that were made in Fullerton that come with the certificates. So the 52 reissue, right?
Right.
And then the 57 or 62 Strat.
Right.
But just like custom shop today, it's more valuable if you have the goodies. So make sure you've got the case, you've got some of them did have paper COAs, and then you got the goodies, the ashtray cover.
Right. And that horrible jack that's actually one of the greatest jacks there are. I use those AVR early jacks for my vintage Fenders because the impedance is perfect on those. It matches those early ones. Now, in Japan, they started making reissues also. Those don't go for the same as the American, but those go for big bucks now too, don't they? Some of those early made in Japan.
When they started making those reissues in Japan, they were actually better than some of the American-made stuff that was coming up.
They were more accurate, I think. They actually had some of the details better than the American-made ones did.
It wasn't as clunky. It was just a better guitar. And, I think it just made Fender wake up. Well, again, remember at that time, that was it. They were sort of on their last legs. They were going to fold. I think when Fender went up for sale, you might even remember, Ram, whenever that was, 82, 83. I mean, you could have bought it for $1 million or $2 million.
Right. You just couldn't buy the inventory. You bought the inventory. You couldn't buy the factory.
So, it wasn't that expensive.
How much do you think that the early made in Japan Strat reissues go for now? The earliest ones?
I've gotten mid to high teens for those.
Mm-hmm. Because I've definitely tell people look for them. The made Japan 80s stuff is priced very reasonable, and it's incredibly very well made. Very great guitars.
Well, even the ones that came out a little bit later, those pink paisley and blue floral tellies double like in a year. Those were going $500, $600, $700. Now those are mid-teens.
Right. So if you got $2,000 and you want to buy a nice vintage guitar, there's definitely things out there perfect for you that are tone monsters. There's also Stratocasters that you could buy that are actually 40, 50-year-old Stratocasters now. So there's quite a bit out there. And that's one of the things like last week we talked about, I talked about these 6-figure guitars. Well, now that's why this week I just want to talk about, $2,000 will get you something very, very nice. $2,500. And there's always something out there you can find, explore. And that's kind of like what being a vintage guitar collector is. It's finding those special ones, the ones that have magic, the tone monsters.
Well, the best advice I can give someone if they're going into a shop, especially if it's a bigger shop, like ours, where there's a lot of inventory on the walls. I'm talking like several hundred guitars or even over 1,000 guitars that are hanging on the wall. There's that old adage, sometimes you can't see the forest through the trees. So if you're going into a shop, really take your time to kind of peruse the walls. Look for those gems that are tucked behind. Usually shops, they've got things they're grouped together. All the Fenders are together, all the Gibsons are together. But every now and then you might see something that's tucked behind a Fender or a Gibson that maybe shouldn't be there. So go in with your eyes wide open. Don't always just gravitate right towards Fender or right towards Gibson, the Coke and the Pepsi or the Chevy and the Fords of guitars, right? Look beyond those. Try to find some of those sleepers that, are coming up in price.
And we mentioned Guild, we mentioned Epiphone, we mentioned some of the USA, the Sandias, or some of the stuff that was made in Illinois, like the Hamer, the Dean. Those things. Look for the late 70s USA made stuff. Those are going places, and they're great guitars. The craftsmanship is outstanding. So that's it. That's you can find plenty of good stuff out there, and
you certainly can. Yeah, you just got to take some time and pick them up. Don't just go in and look and walk by it. Take it off the wall. You might really be surprised at what you find when you get your hands around the neck, because, you know, they're all different. Once you sit down with it, you plug it in, you know, different pickups sound different, and take your time. You certainly can find a really cool sleeper guitar if you just take the time to look.
All right, John, I appreciate your time. I know how busy you are, and I really appreciate this. I think this will be very helpful to people out there who are looking for something special.
I'm glad I could help. Yeah, thank you, Ram. Thank you for calling, and I please stay in touch. I do appreciate that. Thank you.
All righty. Hey, we'll talk to you again soon.
All right, you take care.
Okay, take care.
Bye now.
Bye. Thank you for listening to Buy That Guitar, presented by Vintage Guitar Magazine. Please support Vintage Guitar Magazine for all they do for guitar players like me and you. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment on this podcast. I'd love to hear from you. See you again real soon.
Need a drive pedal that delivers serious tone? Meet the Soul Drive, powered by legendary Tongue Soul 12AX72 for that classic tube-driven warmth and responsiveness. From creamy blues to screaming solos, every note reacts to your touch. Built with tool-grade durability, this pedal is ready for any stage or studio. Get the Soul Drive today at mojo.com.